Hi guys, today I've put together a video for a more entry-level Lightroom user. What I'm going to do is process one landscape photo that I just recently took on a little mini expedition. It's a frosted tree out in the middle of a field, and basically I'm going to walk you through the Lightroom Develop module and just show you what each of the sliders does, why I'm using them on this particular image, and hopefully that will give you some ideas of how you can utilize those sliders and everything to actually affect your own photography. So stay with me, let's dive right in and see what we can do. The first thing you'll notice nowadays with Lightroom is that Adobe have actually moved the profile tab in the Develop module all the way to the top. This used to be buried way down, deep down, but it's actually the first thing you want to do to your photo is apply a profile. So if I flick through a couple of these, you'll see that the image changes. It's only slight, it's subtle, but it does change. What I like to do as a starting point is actually come in and choose something that's camera matching. So I shot this on the Nikon D850. According to Lightroom, these profiles should match and work well with a Nikon D850. For this particular one, I'm not going for something really contrasty. What I actually want is the opposite. I want quite a flat, neutral starting point. By selecting this, we can actually see that there's just a little bit more information showing through here, through the whole image, in my opinion. When we go to landscape, you can see all of a sudden it's gone really dark through the tree trunk there, and I prefer this. So anyway, that's my starting point, a flat starting point. I'm now going to close that. The next thing we'll come across is the white balance. As you can see, as shot, nowadays the cameras that we have are really good at getting a good white balance, which is just how warm or cool the image looks, and I would be happy with this as a starting point. So we won't touch that at all. We'll come down to exposure and contrast. So first thing, exposure. Is it too bright? Is it too dark? We have that complete control to put the image where we want this to be. What I would always recommend is grab these sliders, throw them all the way to the top, throw them all the way to the bottom, and just see what they're doing. If you don't know how they work, that's a really good way to get a feel for what they're up to. But we can see with the exposure at 0, our histogram, which shows the distribution of light values at the most basic level, from how much dark there is in the scene to how much light there is in the scene. We can see that on the left here, this is our blacks. On the right here, this is our whites. We don't have a pure white, we don't have a pure black at the moment. That's partly due to the fact that we've chosen a camera flat profile to start with, but I'm happy with that. But what we can do, rather than brighten everything up or darken everything, we can kind of get a zone where we're happy with, and we can then use the whites and the blacks to increase the range of this histogram. And I always like the idea that when you're working on a photo, you have a starting point which is black and a finishing point that is white, for the most part. It's not true for everything, but for the most part, if you have white in your image, make sure that your histogram is showing that you are at white. What you can do is actually turn on or click this little icon in the top right, click this one in the bottom left, and that will actually give you warnings if you're going into pure black, or this one on the top right would say, hey, you're going into pure white there. So obviously we want to avoid bleaching out completely or pushing so dark that we're getting pure blacks. I want this to be quite a low contrast image anyway. I want it to have a nice pastel-y, tranquil kind of feel to it when I'm finished, and a high contrast image isn't really going to achieve that, so I want to keep everything kind of neutral. So once I actually do the whites and the blacks usually before I look at the highlights and shadows. But highlights and shadows are really powerful because often you can recover a bit of information here. In this case, not, because everything that's a highlight is pretty much fog, so there's nothing really to recover. So we could pretty much leave that where it is. I'll just bring it down a little bit just so we're not bleaching this area out here. The shadows, which is going to talk into directly address, I would say, the grass and the tree trunk. we can actually, as we bring that up, you can see again, like slide it around, super dark, super bright. I actually like the fact that we're bringing a lot more information, visual information into the tree trunk, into the grass. That's awesome. Once you have had a little play around with your white, once you've played around with the highlights and shadows, you may want to jump back in and just readjust those blacks and the whites. If at any point you want to see what you've done as a before and after, you can hit the backspace key on your keyboard and everything disappears. How very strange. Cut that bit out. So we have a wide dynamic range now on this image, from the whites at one end down to nearly the blacks, but I don't want to push all the way to black because I want to keep detail through in here, and like I say, soft and pastel-y is the way forward for me. So I'm actually now going to come into the contrast slider, and now we've pinned the white and the black point, I can reduce that down and get a more pastel kind of look to this without losing the blacks and the whites and having it too washed out. So contrast does what it says on the tin. You're going to increase or decrease contrast. So I'm just going to decrease it ever so slightly. The clarity, man, I love this slider. Done with a touch of restraint can be really, really great. If I push that all the way, you really start to see those details popping through. Not enjoying it for this image, but it's a fantastic slider to play around with and make sure the image is looking the way you want it to, and increase some of that local contrast. When I say local contrast, I'm talking about the contrast between small areas, localized, rather than our contrast slider that does the whole image more so. Our clarity slider is talking about on a much more fine-tuned scale. I'm going to stick that somewhere around there just for now. Dehaze is a new addition to Lightroom, newer addition to Lightroom. It controls, well, let me grab it and show you the haziness of the image. To the left, we're creating a foggy, desaturated, hazy look. Go to the right, and it's doing the opposite. By playing around with the dehaze slider and the clarity slider, you actually start to push your whites and blacks again because they are introducing contrast. Personally, I was quite enjoying just a little bit of this dehaze coming in there. But as you can see again, these red warnings here, they're saying, hey, your whites are peaking here. You need to pull that back down, which we can do. Pull the white slider back down, or just get it to the point where they just start to disappear. Fantastic. Okay. Now, one of the things that Lightroom is great for is localized adjustments. By looking at this top panel here in Lightroom, the basic panel, we have covered the basics of the image already. One thing we didn't look at was the temperature, but color temperature, I was happy with that. But you can give it a really distinctive look by doing one of three things, basically going for a realistic representation of the colors as they were, or you can, for artistic and aesthetic reasons, say, hey, I want to make this image nice and warm, I want to make this image really cool. So for this particular frosty image, we may want to say, hey, look, let's dial down the color temperature and push it more towards the blues, and that might be what you're going for. I'm just going to turn these warnings off just for now so that big red highlight isn't affecting our perception of the image. But look, let's bring the whites down just slightly. The color temperature, pushing that towards blue, pushing it towards orange. We can have a look at what's going on and make a judgment call on that. But what I was wanting to do with this particular image was say, when I photographed it, in the foreground there was a lot of this nice orangey grass, this browny rusty looking grass with the white snow laying on top, and then just above the fog layer, which we can't really see in this particular frame, but the sky was starting to show through, the blue of the sky, and it was creating this really nice complementary colour band sandwich of blue at the top, orange at the bottom, white in the middle, and I thought that's kind of interesting. But as I say, you can't really see that in this image. You can see a little bit on the left hand side here, the blue poking through. However, there was more blue when you were there. It's just in this particular framing, I don't see it. I would like to use Lightroom to bring some of that back. We're going to kind of fake it. That's my idea anyway. So using local adjustments, we can have access to the same sliders we were working with before, but talk to specific parts of the image. And this is a really, really powerful tool. So if I grab this particular one here, this is the radial filter. I really love this filter. We can click and drag out. As you can see at the moment, nothing's happened here, but that is because we have not done anything with our sliders. So for example, if I was to bring the exposure way down on that, you can see it's darkening through this radial filter here, which I can place anywhere on my image. So we now have control over this. We have a feathering as well, which is to soften the edges, and that's a really nice way to, if you push that all the way up, you can have a more smooth transition from the center to the outside of these radial filters, and by feathering, it's more realistic. If you go the opposite way, you can see you get a hard edge around the outside, the circumference of the circle. So look, let's put our feathering where we want it. Somewhere up high, from 75 to 100. That's always quite nice. From here, now what we can do, what I'm wanting to try and do, is reintroduce this blue. So if we introduce blue over the top of pure white, we're not really going to see anything. But if I darken this down to a grey, I'm going to go to the extreme and then fade it out just a little bit. If I get the color temperature, you can see, I can say, hey, what color do I want to introduce? That's one way of doing this. We can go kind of purpley or blue, but whatever. There's also this color picker down here, so you can be specific about colors that you want to add into localized adjustments. For this example, let's stick with picking a color. The higher up you go on selecting the color, the more the saturated the color will be, the stronger it will be, and as you pull down to the bottom, the less saturated it becomes, and really it's having less of an effect. So here we want to match the sky color that we've kind of got going on the left hand side. So if I just have a little click around, start to see that. Now I need to ease off on my exposure here. And one good way to check how your image is looking is, rather than looking at the big picture, the full-size image you're working with in front of you, I find it really helpful and easier on the eye to make these judgment calls when you look to the top left-hand corner at the thumbnail. If you look there, I find that is a much easier way to make that call. Like, is it too dark? Like at the moment, I find it's not saturated enough. So if I click here, I can either move my color picker point up, but if I'm happy with the color, the easiest way to do it is just grab this saturation slider. 100%, 0%. Where do I want that to be? Let's go somewhere around there. Looks good in my thumbnail view, and I'm introducing some blue there. Lovely. Now let's see what we can do about the bottom here, see whether we can actually introduce more orangey tones into the grass itself, so we're enhancing that blue and orange complementary color look. So here, rather than using a radial filter, because the grass spans left to right in one straight line, we can use the linear filter. So it works in the same way in terms of having those controls. However, rather than being a circular filter like we had before, we've now got a linear filter. So if I crank up, I tell you what, let's go down with the exposure. If I just start drawing a line, you can see how, but from the bottom through the middle to the top, whatever changes you make that is going to fade through that transition. So that gives you good scope to kind of fade this. Whatever you want to do, you can fade it through. So let's change the color here and watch it fade through from the bottom on the grass. So our color temperature, if we push this more towards the yellows, maybe some magenta, let's have a look. All of a sudden we can see we're starting to see more of that oranginess of the grass. A little bit of the magenta to show through as well. That's quite nice. Now the problem that we've got is not only is it affecting the grass, it's also affecting the snow, which I don't want orangey pink snow. I want nice white snow. So what we can do is come down to our range mask, select color, and then we're just going to click on some of the grass, kind of a middle of the road grassy color, something like this. Now, as you can see, if the amount is at 0, it's very, very specific about what it's targeting. But as we drag this to the right, it starts to introduce more of that grassy color. We can go all the way to 100, and it's quite good. It's not really affecting the snow at all. Okay, guys, let's move on. Working our way down the palette, and we're going to take a look at the tone curve now. Tone curves are a fantastic tool for creating contrast in your image that you control. Rather than just grabbing a slider and moving it left and right, you can be super specific with these. So let me show you what I mean. So we can grab the center of this line here, and as we bring it up, we're going to brighten the overall image while keeping our white and black point, which are represented here, the black point. Up here is the white point. They stay in the same place. We can bring that down, and we're going to introduce more contrast like that. We can do a classic S curve, which is bringing the shadows down and grabbing this point up here and bringing the highlights up. That will add more contrast to an image too. In this case, this is not what we want. What if we went the other way? So bring that down and this up. This creates the opposite effect, which is actually to reduce contrast. And in this instance, I quite like that for this particular image. By grabbing the darks here, we're actually just bringing in a little more detail into the shadows as well, or visible detail, not strictly adding detail, but we can see more. What we can also do, if our white point, by moving the sliders, our white is no longer a true white, we can actually grab the very top slider and move that to where it meets the histogram again. And when it meets the histogram, we know that we now have a pure white again. But any moving of this curve, or these points on the curves, is going to affect the rest of the curve. So just be mindful of that. And if you do have the shape of the curve that you like, and then you move one of these handles, you're going to have to readjust that. So I suggest making sure that you pin the top right and the bottom left where you want them before you start making adjustments to the shape of the curve. So I'm happy with that. What you can also use the tone curve for is not just contrast through the luminosity, the actual brightness values of the image. You can actually control color. So on this drop down here, you've got red, green, blue, represented by RGB. We can then come in and actually speak to specifically the red, green, or blue channel. I love coming into the blue channel, grabbing the top right and then dragging it down, and we're going to introduce some yellows into the highlights. See that? No color toning. Bring that down. Let me go really extreme and you'll see what it's doing. It's making that super yellow, right? And you can grab the bottom left and make changes there as well. You can do that for each channel. So have a play around with that and see some nice effects you can do. But again, moderation is the key. You don't want to go too cray-cray with this. But personally, I like to just add a little bit of warming yellow into the highlights. Even with an image like this, it's like frosty and cold. I'm trying to create a bit of a mood with this, and by changing the tone curve slightly, you can actually introduce a little bit of a feeling into your photos. That's where some of the artistry actually comes in. You know, yes, you've taken the capture, you've brought that home. Now it's time not just to make it look as good as it can look in terms of exactly as you saw it. If you want to, you can actually push it into the realms of something more artistic that was your vision at the time of capture. So let's say that's what we're doing here. Let's bring this down slightly further. So we're making the fog and the haze, rather than just being a pure clinical white, kind of yellowy, and then the shadows, if we wanted to keep that cool feeling, we could bring the blues up just in the shadows. And I'm starting to dig on that. That's quite nice. You're not restricted to the end points. You can add a point in the middle and do things here as well. So you're controlling the midtones. But to be honest, let's get rid of that. We just right click and delete it. As we move down into the color and the hue, saturation and luminance tab, this has a really powerful place as well. For example, if we wanted to darken the blues that we've created, we'd come to the luminance. Think of brightness, how bright or dark something is, how luminance it is. That's not good English. Let's grab the blue slider. If we bring this down to the left, you'll see that the blue in the image is starting to darken. Because we're using a smart preview, the gradients that we're seeing do not look particularly good, but in the finished image, that would be a pretty smooth gradient. For me, that's way too much, but you can see what we can do. We could go the opposite way and brighten those as well, but I think maybe we could just bring those down ever so slightly, and happy with that. Split toning we can use to control in the same way we had the tone curve and we were grabbing the channel, the blue channel, and we made it more yellow in the highlights, blue in the shadows. A much more simple way to do that, but with less fine tuning, is in the split toning panel. You can come in here, click on this tab here and just choose a color that you say, hey, I want my highlights to be red. Boom. Hey, I want my shadows, clicking on the bottom one, to be green. Wow, isn't that a great picture? Finesse done wisely, this can be a nice tool. So let's say a little bit of purple, and let's come in with a nice orangey hue for the highlights. And by making your own recipe of using the tone curve with color adjustments and the split toning, you can create your own unique look that you can then later save as a preset, which I won't go into in this video, but that is an option. Anyway, for this particular one, do we want it on? Do we want it off? It's kind of adding a nice pinky tone to this. If you would prefer more of your highlight color to show through, you push the balance to the right, or if you want more of the shadow color to show through, push the balance to the left. So at this point, we're really getting into the realms of artistic preference. And this is a bit in Lightroom that I really love, just playing around, seeing what you enjoy with a particular image. Moving on, let's look at the detail tab. Now this is for sharpening and noise reduction. So for sharpening, it totally depends on your lens, your camera, how crisp the sensor is. What I suggest doing is just zoom into a 1:1 view, which you can see here, 100% view, and just assess how sharp is my image. And we're pretty sharp. Perhaps we could push this a little bit further. This was shot on the Nikon D850, as I said, so we've got pixels to burn. We've got 46 megapixels, which is a luxury. As you increase the radius, the sharpening is comparing more pixels. So a radius of 3 is comparing the 3 pixels with adjacent 3 pixels and saying how sharp do I need to make this? I'm not going to get into sharpening. It's you can, by sliding the slider, you can make your image sharper. But just be mindful of how far you push that. If you have shot at a particularly high ISO, you'll find that there will start to be noise in the image or grain. When you're talking about digital photos, it's referred to as noise, but you would probably associate that with traditional grain from a camera, or film, sorry. So grab your noise reduction and you can bring that up, and you'll see, providing that this is rendering nicely on YouTube, you'll see that what was there in terms of little speckly noise through our image, if we crank that all the way up, that will just disappear. Again, you need to be careful with this slider, because if I come down to where there's actually detail in the grass, if I slide this slider all the way to 100%, you watch what happens. All of a sudden we've got a more illustrative look to our photo, and if I get rid of it again, we see it more real life. So it becomes a balance. What do you want to show? What do you want to achieve? Personally, the noise reduction cranked quite high on photos where you want a more illustrative, but illustrative look. Push it to the right, and that starts to help give that effect. Now, lens correction. This is a good one. If you look in the left-hand corner here, every lens has something called chromatic aberration, and that is, without getting too technical, basically a fringing will appear in your photo where you start to see green on one side of a line, magenta on the other, and it can look pretty horrible. Here you can see it if you're looking closely here. Let's come in even closer. You can see this fringing. Now this wonderful panel, lens correction, has a checkbox where we can tick it and remove chromatic aberration. And although it has not done a perfect job in this instance, it's made it look much better than it was. So this is off, turn it on, and all of a sudden that fringing starts to disappear. So I would recommend always having that on. Enable the profile correction. Will try and find your camera's default lens profile. So whatever lens was on your camera when you shot a picture, Lightroom will say, what lens was that? If the lens is a little bit funky, which most of them are, they're not perfect optically, so there might be a little bit of warping of your lens that you don't normally notice, but if you're photographing a building, for instance, the edges might start to get bowed one way or another. You can use, by ticking that box, you can actually hopefully eliminate it. And normally Lightroom does a pretty good job. So give that a tick, see what it does for you in your image. Personally, when I'm working with landscape photos, I normally leave it off because there are no discernible lines in the foreground, at the side of the frame, nothing architectural which is going to give the game away that your lens warps slightly. I mean, this is a high-end Nikon lens, and you can see by me turning it on and off, Lightroom thinks it's got some pretty bad distortion on that particular lens. So I don't know what lens you guys are working with, but you know, if it's doing that on a $3,500 lens, who knows what a kit lens is doing. Anyway, I'm going to turn that off because you'll also notice there's vignetting, which you can dial down, you can push all the way to the top. That's supposed to be correcting for the darkening in the corners of your lens. So when you take a photo, normally the brightest part of the image is bang in the center and it gets darker towards the edges. This slider corrects for that. But sometimes I like a bit of lens vignetting because it guides your eye to the brightest part of the image, which is what you want. So I'm going to leave that alone. Transform, great tools in here particularly for architectural work. Where you can rotate your picture one way or another. So if you're pointing up towards a skyscraper, down towards the floor, there's converging, you can correct that. Don't need it for landscape work. You can put a vignette on yourself after you've cropped an image. I'm happy with the crop of this. I don't need to crop it. And one last thing we can look at is grain, which, as you can see in this image, when we've zoomed into 2:1, now we'll go to 100% view, there is some grain in this image already. Sometimes you want to add a little more just to make it look a bit more grungy and grunty. You can change the size of that grain. If I go all the way so you can actually see what it's doing, it's putting like a traditional film grain over your image. And for an artistic look, that might be what you're after. Again, I would advise caution with how far you take that. Normally, if I work an image like this one, for instance, I'm going to look at this in 5 minutes time, having had a break from the screen and gone, whoa, that's not how I wanted it. That's too saturated, or too contrasty. So what's next? We've gone through all our panels. Our calibration's the last one. I would just leave that well enough alone for now. Keep it simple. So any final tweaks you may want to do, you may want to come back in and look at, okay, do I want to change the color temperature, make it more blue in the sky? Perhaps, because we've actually increased the orange in the foreground, we can still push that towards a colder color temperature and the orange pretty much stays as it was. I quite like that. Now, two sliders we haven't really looked at, but do play a big part in many photos, and that is your vibrant slider. Let's push that all the way to the right, or get rid of it completely, or your saturation slider. And you may be thinking, what's the difference? They do very similar things. I would just say that vibrance is more of a conservative way to put color into your images. It tends to protect skin tones and things like that, but I recommend just have a play around. I quite liked what it was doing with the blues in the sky, for instance, really bringing out that vibrancy here, but perhaps a little too much, but let's just say we're happy with that for now. Now I want to say to the whole image, desaturate slightly. You would notice actually when I push that all the way to -100, there's still color toning in the image. Why is that, you might think? And that is because things like split toning and also your tone curve pay no regard for whether you've decided to desaturate your image. That's done after. So you've done the desaturating higher up in the food chain in Lightroom, and then lower down, as you've worked down the panels, you've reintroduced color toning through that split toning and also your tone curve. So that's why we've got a slight coloration to this, and you'll also notice that the top right is really blue, and that is because, again, this particular adjustment here, where we dialed in a blue color, that is not controlled by the saturation slider. So if we go back to our basic panel, I'm just going to put the saturation where I would like it to be. If you remember, initially I said I want a kind of pastel-y look, so we were at 0 here. Too much saturation. I want to just dial that back slightly and see how we're looking. I'm starting to like that. I still feel that perhaps the blues are a little too rich. So if I come back into our color tab here, I can speak directly to those blues. I think we did bring that down too far. It didn't really need to be there. We can bring the saturation tab, and if I bring this all the way to the left, you're going to see I just get rid of all of that blue there, apart from where we added the radial filter, because this will not affect that. But if we bring that saturation down just a smidge, and bring the luminance up slightly. No, I liked it where it was. Now, as one last thing that I think I will try with this, it may not work, is just to add a radial filter to create a fake vignette. So if I pull this over here, at the moment you can see we're darkening the tree. Let's invert that by ticking this box here, and now we see the tree is brighter, everything else is darker, but obviously it looks pretty hideous at the moment. But we're on a -4 exposure. You can see exactly what's going on here. Let me bring that out there. If I increase the feathering, you'll see how the softness comes in again, but it does create like a really hot spot right there in the middle. So let's just ease that off ever so slightly. If you want to increase the size of your vignette, this is a great little tip. If you want to increase the size of your vignette and you've run out of space, screen real estate to actually increase this, what you can do is just come to your navigator change the view size to say something like 1:8, or you can even go 1:16, and all of a sudden you've got the option to drag your handles out far beyond the side of the screen, and that is often really handy, really helpful. So now I can move that around. The tree's starting to take on a little bit of more interest, I feel, in this image. Let's bring it back to 1:1. Sorry, not 1:1. Fit in view is always a good option. So just click on fit. And now we know where the vignette is. We can just dial that back just slightly, so it's not as in your face as this, but we can just put it where we would like that to be. Perhaps something like that. The other thing I would like to do to this image, I did say I was done. I lied. Let me show you, just a little bonus, one more thing I'd like to show you, how you can control fake fog basically on a horizon line using the bit of negative clarity and also negative dehaze. So let's zero out everything. And let's just draw ourselves a little radial circle along on the horizon line here. If we grab the clarity and bring that down, we'll start to see everything soften through there. If I put that back where it was, you'll see before and after. It just softens everything. So that already gives it the sense of fogginess. But one thing I would like to do is just brighten it up on the horizon ever so slightly. That might be too much. Maybe just plus 0.23. Happy with that. And the dehaze. So if you remember, if we push dehaze all the way to the left, it brightens everything up. Go the other way and it will make everything a bit richer. So by using that, again, with moderation, we can create a kind of soft fogginess on the horizon. Now we just need to work with making sure it looks believable by blending it in. So if we drag that across that horizon line there, I don't want to run it through the middle of the tree and tree trunk, but let's go with that. Perhaps we want it a little brighter just so we can kind of see what we're up to here. Now, as you can see, there's a pretty strong transition from here up to the sky, and you can see that even more accentuated in our thumbnail, which really showcases and impacts us with potential mistakes we've made by taking things too far. If we crunch the feathering up on that, we can see that transition becomes much smoother. And now if we want to duplicate what is going on here with the fog on the other side, we can right click on that radial adjustment, duplicate it, drag it over this side, and now we can just grab the handle from the left hand side and bring it in again so it doesn't go over all of the tree. We might have it just creep in on the right hand side and it just feathers in. And let's say, for the sake of saying we're done with this, might want to brighten the exposure again just slightly. Now we've increased that vignette. Yeah, that's totally overcooked. Bring that back down just a smidge. And we may want to just protect those whites by bringing those back down just a little bit. Lovely. Okay, we'll turn off those and we can hit full screen and we can see what we've done. So that is our image of our frosty tree. Before and after. So guys, I hope you've liked that. This really wasn't supposed to be a I hope you love this image that I've created. It was more a beginner's walkthrough, beginner's intermediate walkthrough of the Lightroom Develop module, looking at the radial filters, linear filters, and looking at all the sliders within the Develop module and showing you an overview of what different things do, and also giving you some suggestions about when you should be playing with which slider. So I hope that was useful for you, and thank you very much for watching. Guys, I will catch you in the next video. Oh, if you did like it, do me a favor, please hit that subscribe button. It would mean a lot to me. Thank you very much. Have a good one.